I know you're all taking an hour or so of your time, so in return, I do promise to give you as much of this insider information on the found money business as I can. Now, I'm going to be revealing a business to you I've been working for years as a sideline while I've been buying and selling houses, and it's become more and more my focus lately because of this down real estate market and, you know, because all the benefits this business has, and I'm going to go over all those tonight. Now, I'm going to be covering a lot, so I encourage you all, grab a pen and paper real quick and take some notes down on what you're going to be learning. I'm going to be showing you exactly how I locate and recover 4- and 5-figure sums of unclaimed funds that people don't even know they have, which arose from a piece of property that they once owned. And there's a lot of things that you're going to want to remember. So without any further ado, let's get going here. How did I get started in the found money business? Well, it was actually quite a long, winding road that began with pretty old-fashioned, typical real estate investing. Just like many, many investors I've met in the past, I got started in real estate by, you guessed it, rehabbing houses. And here are some pictures from the first one I bought back in the year 2000. Now, I just borrowed $20,000 from my parents, used some money I had saved up to fund those repairs, and I rolled up my sleeves on this sucker. Now, I don't have to tell you how fun it was to deal with properties that started off looking like this. I mean, once you get rid of all the garbage and all that other stuff you can see in these pictures here, you find all sorts of nice surprises that you weren't counting on, like rotten floors, walls, termites, all that stuff. I'm sure you've all heard of those nightmares. And I'd even come home with fleas jumping all over me sometimes because of the nasty houses I was looking at and working on. Now, I practically spent my life at that first house for 3 straight months doing all of that work myself. And when I got done, I was really lucky. I managed to sell it for a profit of about $15,000. And I was really lucky that that house sold quick, or I would have been waiting on the sidelines with all that borrowed money tied up, watching my profit evaporate. Now, that $15,000 profit didn't seem so bad at first, especially since I was happy to turn my first deal over. But shortly after I sold that property, I sat and did the math, and I realized I made about $10 or $15 an hour for all the time that I spent working on that thing. And plus, I took a lot of risk with my money. So I didn't want to keep slaving away myself on these houses like 80 hours a week like I was. So gradually I got a crew together, and next thing I knew, I was rehabbing dozens of houses each year. But I could never seem to pull myself away from managing all those projects going on. And I was pretty much just, you know, zipping from one project to another, putting out fires. I mean, not literally, luckily, but I mean, you know, handling problems, and it was just about as stressful as doing all that work myself. And then after a hard day of work, back to the office at night in my grungy clothes to pay bills, deal with those contractors, and worst of all, try to sell these darn houses. And I'm glad I don't come home from work looking like that anymore, believe me. Now, there's a point to all this. I know you're not here to learn about rehabbing or to hear me complain about it. Now, as I started doing more deals, I noticed I was buying a majority of my fixer houses from one broker in town almost exclusively. And one day I asked him where all his listings were coming from. His name was Jonathan. He's actually my attorney now, fast forward 10 years. And he was a real estate investor in town who did a little brokering on the side at the time. And it turned out that all these properties he was selling, all these fixer properties, were mostly from a couple large national tax sale buyers who spent millions of dollars every year at our county's tax sale. Now, these companies would come in, they'd invest their money in tax liens, and either make some interest from those tax liens, or they'd end up owning the delinquent property itself if the delinquent taxpayer didn't pay up within a year. And these companies wound up owning a lot of properties in the low to middle class area that I was working. So Jonathan and I struck up a friendship, and one day he called and said, hey, why don't we cut out these middlemen and try to get involved in the tax sale ourselves? And I thought that was a great idea, and we set out to buy some tax liens at the next sale. Now, there were hundreds of good properties with delinquent taxes that we could bid on that were coming out for that fall sale. And I had my sights set on a few properties in my hometown that were being offered for, let's say, a minimum bid of $10,000 or so. You can see a nice property. That property was actually offered at a tax sale with a minimum bid of $10,000. And that was worth at least $150,000, maybe $200,000. I also researched some properties in the lower priced area where I was rehabbing, thinking maybe I could get some inventory from there. And those were being offered for as little as $2,000 or $3,000 in some cases. Now, here's what actually happened. I went to bid on the properties that I really wanted, those nice ones that were starting out at 10 grand, and I couldn't believe how high these national companies were bidding the prices up to, usually as much or more than the properties were even worth. And I learned later that these companies have millions of dollars that they need to park at a good interest rate, so they end up outbidding all the small guys on these good properties like me. So those good properties were out, and I didn't even have the money to buy them, and even if I did, the properties were going for much more than I was willing to pay. I certainly wasn't willing to pay $150,000 for a property that might be worth $200,000 if I didn't discover any nasty surprises inside. So near the end of the sale, the county started offering maybe the last set of properties that I had identified in the lower income areas where I was rehabbing. And even on those, there was enough bidding activity to take me out of the game most of the time. But I ended up getting about 10 tax liens on okay-looking properties that kind of look like this ugly green house here. And I began waiting the year that it would take before I could get the title to the property if I wasn't paid off. So I left that sale feeling pretty frustrated. That bidding system was always going to keep me from making any real money at the tax sale, I realized right then. But as I'll show you later in the webinar, it turns out I was dead wrong. That bidding at foreclosure auctions and tax sales is what allows us to make five-figure checks as found money professionals. And you might want to write that down. Bidding at tax sales and mortgage foreclosures leads to the unclaimed funds that we're going to target and talk about tonight. And that'll all make more sense in just a little bit here. Now, back to those tax liens I was able to buy. Guess what happened there? Every single lien that I bought paid me off. So I didn't even get a single property. I just got a small amount of interest for that big cash investment that I made. So at that point, I was just about positive that tax sales really had no benefit for me. Now, it wasn't all completely a waste, though, because one of the contacts I made during that time when I was rehabbing houses and getting started with tax sales was a more experienced guy named Jim who lived nearby and bought a lot of tax liens also. Now, he always seemed to have tons of money to play with, and sometimes I'd even see him compete with the big boys I was telling you about for those tax liens on the expensive properties. But like me, he never seemed to get any properties from the tax sale either. He was always paid off. Every time he'd buy a lien, he'd just make some interest on it, and I couldn't see how he built up such a bankroll just doing that. He wasn't a whole lot older than me. It's not like he was 70 years old or something and had been compounding his money for 30 years. He was barely older than I was. I think he was 35 or something at the time. So I asked him why he was messing around with buying tax liens when he had all this money to use to do other deals like the rehabs I was doing. Now, I knew I'd be making a lot more money if I didn't have to use private lenders for my rehabs, which I had started doing as my business group. And for years, all Jim would tell me was that he had a backdoor way of making some huge money from the tax sale, but he couldn't talk about it. Maybe he'd let me in on it someday once I stopped doing this foolish rehabbing business, he said, So a while later, we were at the county tax sale office seeing what properties were about to be in the next tax sale. And as we were leaving, the clerk called out to him, "Hey, Jim, your check's here." But there were no active tax sales going on at that time where Jim could be getting paid off on one of his tax liens. So that really puzzled me. And it had been since the last year that we had talked about his little secret, his backdoor method. And I finally talked him into stopping for a beer across the street afterward and cluing me in. And there he finally spilled the beans. He'd been collecting tax sale overages for people for years and charging 30 to 50% of the amount he collected as a fee. And by then I'd also started wondering what happened to all that extra money that was sometimes paid in for these tax sale properties, like in that example I just showed you, above and beyond what the owner actually owed in the delinquent taxes. Now, it turned out Jim had stumbled upon this whole thing himself. He'd made friends with a girl that worked at the tax sale office years ago, and one day she whispered to him, "Hey, I can't believe all this unclaimed money we're seizing from the tax sale we had 3 years ago. No one's coming in to collect this stuff." So what do you suppose his reaction was?